The Open Ground Society presents Perpetualism, the Open Ground Ontology, Abstract. There's a moment in philosophical inquiry when you realize you're trapped in an impossible situation. You desperately need to understand reality, to know what's true, what's real, what you can count on. But every tool you use to understand reality is itself part of the reality you're trying to understand. Your mind, trying to comprehend mind. Your concepts, attempting to capture what lies beyond concepts. Your experience, seeking to grasp the nature of experience itself. This is what I call the problem of our own understanding, the recognition that we can never step outside our own cognitive apparatus to examine it objectively, can never know the truth of reality in and of itself. We are forever locked within the recursive loop of understanding, trying to understand understanding. Most philosophical systems promise to solve this problem. They offer escape routes, pure reason, empirical method, mystical transcendence, logical analysis. But every solution requires the very understanding it claims to transcend. The harder we try to escape the loop, the more entangled we become. This recognition led me into what felt like intellectual vertigo. If we can never truly know reality as it is, what's the point of philosophical inquiry? How do we live authentically in a world we can never fully comprehend? How do we act responsibly when our understanding is always, necessarily, incomplete? But then something unexpected emerged from this apparent dead end. The problem of our own understanding isn't a flaw to be corrected. It's the generative tension that makes authentic engagement possible. The impossibility of final knowledge doesn't paralyze inquiry. It liberates it from the tyranny of certainty. From this fertile impossibility, perpetualism was born. Perpetualism is an open ground ontology, philosophical scaffolding designed not to solve the problem of our own understanding, but to enable creative engagement within its constraints. Built on the recognition that we can never escape the recursive structure of consciousness, it offers tools for navigating uncertainty with discipline rather than being paralyzed by it. The framework emerges through four interdependent components that work recursively together. Isness and suchness arose as my response to the problem of our own understanding, ways of engaging presence and experience that don't require penetrating to some final truth. The triune recursion revealed itself as the underlying pattern through which observer, object, and medium continuously co-create each other, making productive engagement possible within epistemological constraints. The crucial equilibrium emerged as the mechanism for action within recursive uncertainty. Spectrumal thought developed as the discipline of perceiving gradients rather than false binaries, while relational constants appeared as the recurring patterns that enable coherence without dogmatic rigidity. But here's what makes this different. Perpetualism doesn't hide from the problem of our own understanding. It builds from it. Every component acknowledges that our grasp of reality is partial, provisional, and necessarily incomplete. The framework succeeds precisely because it accepts its own limitations and works creatively within them. Through engagement with contemporary thinkers, Harman's withdrawn objects, Meillassoux' absolute contingency, Hand's penetrating but unscaffolded cultural diagnoses, Žižek's dialectical loops, Peterson's archetypal rigidities. We'll see how each fails because they either deny the problem of our own understanding or collapse under its weight. Each tries to achieve some impossible view from nowhere, rather than building scaffolding that functions within the recursive constraints of consciousness. As the work progressed, something deeper emerged. The recursive patterns I was articulating began to feel less like human constructions and more like recognitions of how reality itself is structured. When we speak of quantum uncertainty, we're speaking the language our bodies already know in rupture, our minds in paradox, our histories in the interplay of violence and beauty. The problem of our own understanding isn't a human limitation imposed on an alien cosmos. It's the cosmos recognizing itself through human consciousness. This document concludes with an open challenge. Perpetualism is not to be accepted but tested, engaged, and eventually surpassed, provided such evolution remains disciplined, tension-bearing, and honest about the problem of our own understanding. The problem is permanent. The scaffolding is provisional. The engagement is everything. Introduction: the impossible necessity. Right now, as you listen to these words, you're participating in one of the strangest phenomena in the universe. You're using your mind to think about your mind. You're employing understanding to examine the nature of understanding itself. You're caught in a recursive loop that you can never escape, and that's exactly what makes consciousness possible. This is the problem of our own understanding, and it's the most important philosophical problem you've never heard of. Here's the issue: everything you think you know about reality, including what you think you know about thinking, comes through the very apparatus you're trying to understand. Your brain studying brains, your consciousness investigating consciousness, your concepts attempting to capture what lies beyond concepts. Every tool you use to examine reality is itself part of the reality you're examining. This creates an impossible situation. To truly understand your mind, you'd need to step outside it and observe it objectively. But the moment you step outside to observe, you're using mind to observe mind. To understand understanding itself, you'd need some meta-understanding that doesn't rely on understanding, which is a contradiction in terms. You can't get behind your own eyes to see how seeing works. You can't think your way outside thinking to examine thought from the outside. You can't use consciousness to find some position beyond consciousness from which consciousness becomes transparent. And yet, here's the strange part: you can't stop trying. The drive to understand, to make sense of things, to know what's real and what isn't, seems built into the very structure of conscious existence. We are beings who must understand, trapped in the situation of never being able to understand ourselves completely. The history of elegant failures. The history of philosophy is largely the history of attempts to solve the problem of our own understanding, and the history of these attempts' inevitable failure. Plato tried to solve it by positing eternal forms that could be known through pure reason, independent of the messiness of embodied existence. But his solution required the very mind he was trying to transcend to grasp these perfect forms. The philosopher still needed consciousness to contemplate the good, still needed understanding to apprehend truth. Descartes attempted radical doubt, stripping away everything uncertain until he reached the indubitable foundation of the cogito: I think, therefore I am. But his moment of certainty was still a moment of thinking, still caught within the recursive loop. The cogito doesn't escape the problem of our own understanding. It exemplifies it perfectly, thinking, recognizing itself in the very act of thinking. Kant offered perhaps the most sophisticated attempt, acknowledging that we can never know things in themselves, but only phenomena, as they appear through the structures of human cognition. His critical philosophy mapped the boundaries of reason with extraordinary precision. But even Kant's categories of understanding, space, time, causality, were discoveries made by understanding, using the very faculties they sought to describe. The empiricists tried to ground knowledge in sense experience rather than reason, hoping to bypass the problems of subjective interpretation. But experience itself had to be interpreted, categorized, and understood, bringing us right back to the recursive loop. Even the most careful empirical observation requires a mind that observes, that distinguishes signal from noise, that recognizes patterns and draws inferences. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science represent the latest attempt to solve the problem by studying the brain objectively, as if consciousness were just another natural phenomenon to be explained. But neuroscientists are using consciousness to study consciousness, employing the very faculties they're trying to explain. The recursive loop remains unbroken. Each of these approaches fails not because of inadequate execution, but because of structural impossibility. The problem of our own understanding isn't a puzzle waiting for the right solution. It's the permanent condition within which all thinking occurs. The contemporary collapse. Understanding this recursive trap illuminates why so many brilliant contemporary thinkers ultimately fail to hold the tensions they identify. Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology correctly diagnoses the problem of reducing everything to human access, but his solution, objects that are completely withdrawn from all relation, attempts to solve the problem of our own understanding by postulating a reality that exists independently of any understanding whatsoever. His objects become so withdrawn that they can't participate in the recursive relationships that actually constitute both objects and subjects. Quentin Milasou's speculative realism tries to think reality in itself beyond human correlation, but his absolute contingency becomes a new dogma that requires understanding to grasp. His critique of correlationism is brilliant, but his solution attempts to step outside the very recursive structure that makes critique possible. Byung-Chul Han offers penetrating diagnoses of digital capitalism's recursive loops, how our behaviors generate data that shapes algorithms that modify our behaviors, but his analyses remain trapped in description. He can't provide scaffolding for navigating these loops because he doesn't acknowledge that diagnosis itself occurs within the problem of our own understanding. Slavoj Žižek revels in dialectical loops and paradoxes, but his endless critique becomes a way of avoiding the practical challenge of acting within recursive constraints. His perpetual questioning refuses to acknowledge that questioning itself occurs within the problem it seeks to interrogate. Jordan Peterson tries to ground understanding in archetypal patterns that supposedly transcend historical contingency, but his archetypes still require human consciousness to recognize and interpret them. His solution attempts to solve the problem of our own understanding by appeal to transhistorical structures that are themselves accessible only through understanding. Each of these thinkers offers genuine insights, but each ultimately breaks down because they either deny the problem of our own understanding or try to solve what cannot be solved. The generative recognition. But what if the problem of our own understanding isn't actually a problem to be solved? What if it's the creative constraint that makes authentic philosophical engagement possible? This was the recognition that changed everything for me. The impossibility of stepping outside, understanding to examine understanding objectively, isn't a flaw in human cognition. It's the very structure that makes consciousness, meaning, and creative engagement with reality possible. Think about it this way. If you could step completely outside your own understanding, if you could achieve some impossible view from nowhere, you wouldn't be you anymore. You'd be something else entirely. Some kind of cosmic observer with no particular perspective, no embodied engagement, no creative tension with what you're trying to understand. The recursive structure isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what makes growth, learning, and authentic inquiry possible. Because you can never fully understand yourself, you remain open to surprise, to discovery, to transformation. Because you can never achieve final certainty, you must continue engaging, questioning, refining your understanding through ongoing encounter with what exceeds your grasp. The problem of our own understanding creates what I came to recognize as a generative tension, not a tension to be resolved, but a creative constraint to be worked with. Like a river carving its path through rock, consciousness carves its understanding through the resistance of what it cannot fully comprehend. From this recognition, something unexpected began to emerge: the birth of isness and suchness. Faced with the problem of our own understanding, I found myself asking, how do we engage reality when we can never know it completely? How do we encounter presence when our encounter is always mediated by the very consciousness we're trying to understand? This question led me into what felt like the void between thought and experience, where language falters and the mind hesitates at the threshold of what it cannot name. In this space of trembling uncertainty, two concepts began to crystallize, not as solutions to the problem of our own understanding, but as ways of working creatively within its constraints. Isness emerged as a way of acknowledging presence without claiming to penetrate its ultimate nature. It's what simply is, prior to interpretation, prior to the categories and concepts we use to make sense of experience. Isness doesn't solve the problem of never being able to know reality in itself. It accepts this limitation and finds a way to engage presence that doesn't require final knowledge. Suchness arose as a way of embracing lived experience without needing to explain or control it. It's the world as it presents itself in immediate encounter, before the filters of thought and interpretation have time to organize it into familiar categories. Suchness doesn't transcend the problem of our own understanding. It finds a mode of engagement that functions within the problem's constraints. Together, isness and suchness create what I call the confluence, the dynamic meeting point where presence and response co-create each moment without requiring either to step outside the recursive structure of consciousness. But as I worked with these concepts, an even deeper pattern began to emerge: the discovery of recursive architecture. The problem of our own understanding isn't just a human predicament. It reflects the recursive structure of reality itself. Everywhere I looked, I found the same threefold pattern: observer, object, and medium, locked in continuous co-creation, each element shaping and being shaped by the others. In consciousness, the mind observes thoughts through awareness, but this awareness shapes what thoughts can arise, and those thoughts transform the mind that observes them. In knowledge, scientists study phenomena through methods, but discoveries reshape both the scientists and their methods. In ethics, moral agents encounter situations through frameworks, but those encounters transform both the agent and the framework. In language, speakers convey meaning through words, but the act of communication changes both the speaker and the meaning being conveyed. This pattern, what I call the triune recursion, appears to be the fundamental architecture through which reality organizes itself, wherever consciousness emerges. It's not a human projection onto an alien cosmos, but the cosmos recognizing itself through human awareness. The triune recursion reveals why the problem of our own understanding is permanent, because reality itself is recursively structured. We can't step outside recursive relationships to examine them objectively because there is no outside. Recursion goes all the way down. But this recognition transforms the problem from limitation into opportunity. If reality is recursively structured, then frameworks that work with recursive structure, rather than against it, have a chance of remaining responsive to the complexity they engage. The emergence of perpetualist scaffolding. From these recognitions, perpetualism emerged, not as another philosophical system claiming final truth, but as scaffolding designed to function within the problem of our own understanding. The crucial equilibrium, developed as the mechanism for action within recursive uncertainty, not balance for its own sake, but the dynamic point where recursive tensions can be held without collapse into either paralysis or dogma. Spectrumal thought emerged as the discipline of perceiving gradients rather than false binaries, training awareness to work with the continuous variations within recursive relationships, rather than forcing reality into either-or categories. Relational constants appeared as the recurring patterns that enable coherence across different recursive configurations: trust, restraint, honesty, discipline, courage, not as imposed values, but as observed structural necessities that appear wherever recursive systems achieve sustainable integrity. Each component acknowledges the problem of our own understanding and builds from it rather than trying to solve it. The scaffolding works precisely because it accepts the provisional, partial, and recursive nature of all understanding while providing tools for creative engagement within these constraints. The cosmic mirror. As this framework developed, something profound became clear. The problem of our own understanding isn't a limitation imposed on human consciousness by an alien reality. It's the way reality recognizes itself wherever consciousness emerges. When quantum physicists describe entanglement, they're mapping recursive relationships at the fundamental level of physical reality. When ecologists study coevolution, they're tracing recursive processes at the biological level. When complexity theorists analyze emergence, they're working with recursive dynamics at the systemic level. The human condition isn't separate from the cosmic condition. It's the cosmos becomes self-aware through recursive reflection. When we speak of fracture, we're not being metaphorical. We're describing the same discontinuity that gives rise to space-time granularity. When we speak of interplay, we're not being poetic. We're speaking of the same ontological movement that entangles particles across vast distances. Perpetualism works because it's built along the recursive grain of reality rather than against it. It doesn't try to escape the problem of our own understanding, because that problem reflects the deepest structure of existence itself. The invitation. Over the coming hours, we'll explore how this recursive framework applies across domains, from consciousness and ethics to knowledge and politics, from art and technology to the deepest questions of existence and meaning. We'll see how the triune recursion provides tools for understanding phenomena that other approaches can't adequately address. But we'll also push against the framework's limits. Where does it break down? What tensions can't it hold? What questions does it generate that require new scaffolding altogether? Because ultimately, that's the point. Perpetualism succeeds not by providing final answers, but by creating conditions for better questions. It succeeds not by solving the problem of our own understanding, but by providing tools for engaging that problem more skillfully. The problem of our own understanding is permanent, built into the recursive structure of consciousness itself. But this permanence isn't a limitation. It's the creative constraint that makes growth, discovery, and authentic engagement possible. You are already within the recursive loop. You cannot step outside it, but you can learn to navigate it more consciously, more creatively, more responsibly. You can build scaffolding that enables authentic engagement with reality, even though, especially because, you can never fully comprehend it. The problem is permanent. The scaffolding is provisional. The engagement is everything. The work begins now. Section 1. The collapse of frameworks. First point 1. Classical philosophical attempts. Listen to the sound a philosophical system makes when it encounters the problem of our own understanding. It's not dramatic, no sudden crash, no spectacular failure. Instead, there's a slow grinding, like gears that were never quite designed to mesh, struggling against a resistance they can't identify or overcome. I've been listening to this sound for years, tracing it through the history of human thought. From Plato's eternal forms to Kant's critical architecture, from Nietzsche's will to power to contemporary attempts at systematic philosophy, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Brilliant minds construct elegant systems only to watch them buckle under the weight of their own recursive constraints. The collapse isn't accidental, it's structural. These frameworks fail not because their creators lacked intelligence or insight, but because they were built on assumptions that the problem of our own understanding makes untenable. They assume it's possible to step outside the recursive loop of consciousness, examining consciousness. They promise solutions to what cannot be solved, only dissolved into more skillful engagement. Plato and the problem of abstraction. Plato's theory of eternal forms represents one of philosophy's earliest and most ambitious attempts to solve the problem of our own understanding through pure abstraction. Faced with the flux and uncertainty of the sensible world, Plato posited a realm of perfect, unchanging forms that could be known through reason alone, independent of the messiness of embodied existence. The strategy was elegant. If we can't trust our senses because they're always changing, and if we can't trust our individual perspectives because they're always partial, then perhaps we can access truth through pure rational contemplation of eternal essences, the good, the beautiful, the just. These forms would provide the stable foundation that the world of appearances lacks. But here's where the problem of our own understanding reasserts itself. Who is doing this rational contemplation? The philosopher who seeks to know the forms must still use their mind, their consciousness, their necessarily limited and historically situated understanding to grasp these supposedly eternal truths. The very faculty that Plato wants to transcend, human understanding embedded in time and change, remains the only tool available for the transcendence. The forms were supposed to solve the problem of how we can have knowledge in a world of flux, but they created a new problem. How can a changing, embodied mind gain access to unchanging, abstract forms? Plato's answer, the doctrine of recollection, the immortal soul, the philosopher's ascent, only pushes the problem back a level. The soul that recollects still needs to recognize truth when it encounters it, still needs to distinguish genuine insight from mere opinion. More fundamentally, Plato's solution breaks the recursive connection between knower and known that actually makes knowledge possible. His forms exist in splendid isolation, untouched by the world of becoming, but this very isolation makes them irrelevant to the lived reality they're supposed to illuminate. How can eternal, unchanging abstractions guide action in a world of constant change and particular circumstances? The Platonic project reveals a deeper tension that runs through classical philosophy, the desire to escape. The problem of our own understanding leads to abstractions so pure they lose contact with the reality they were meant to explain. The forms purchase conceptual elegance at the cost of practical relevance, leaving us with beautiful ideas that can't touch the ground of lived experience. Kant's categories in cognitive mediation. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy represents perhaps the most sophisticated attempt to map the boundaries of the problem of our own understanding. Rather than trying to escape the recursive structure of consciousness, Kant attempted to chart its limits with systematic precision. His transcendental idealism acknowledged that we can never know things as they are in themselves, but only as they appear through the structures of human cognition. This was a profound insight. Kant recognized that space, time, and causality are not features of reality, independent of mind, but categories that human understanding brings to experience. We don't discover these structures in the world. We impose them on the world in the very act of having coherent experience. This recognition seemed to solve the problem of our own understanding by accepting it. We can't know reality as it truly is, but we can know the conditions under which we can experience anything at all. But Kant's solution creates its own recursive trap. The critical philosophy requires a philosopher who can somehow step outside ordinary experience to examine the conditions that make experience possible. Kant needs to use understanding to analyze understanding, reason to critique reason, knowledge to establish the limits of knowledge. The transcendental subject who performs the critical analysis must somehow be exempt from the very limitations that analysis reveals. Here's the deeper issue. Kant's categories, space, time, causality, unity, plurality, reality, negation, are presented as fixed structures of human cognition. But these categories were discovered by Kant through philosophical reflection, which means they emerge through the very process of thinking that they're supposed to structure. The categories that make experience possible are themselves products of experience, specifically the experience of philosophical inquiry. This creates a circular dependency that Kant never adequately addresses. The transcendental structures that supposedly make knowledge possible are known only through the empirical process of philosophical investigation. The universal conditions of experience are discovered through the particular historical activity of critical philosophy. The timeless categories emerge through the temporal process of thinking. Moreover, Kant's rigid distinction between phenomena and noumena, between the world as it appears and the world as it is, assumes a kind of metaphysical map that we could never actually draw. How could we know there's a distinction between appearance and reality unless we had some access to both sides of the distinction? The noumenal realm remains forever unknowable, but somehow Kant knows enough about it to distinguish it from the phenomenal realm. The critical philosophy ultimately ossifies the problem of our own understanding, rather than dissolving it. Kant's categories become a kind of cognitive prison, forever separating us from reality as it truly is. While Kant intended to establish the possibility of knowledge within proper limits, he inadvertently created a framework where human understanding becomes permanently alienated from the reality it seeks to comprehend. Nietzsche and the unresolved abyss. Friedrich Nietzsche represents the opposite extreme, from Plato's abstractionism and Kant's systematic criticism. Rather than trying to solve the problem of our own understanding through pure reason or critical analysis, Nietzsche sought to embrace it, to celebrate the creative power of perspective, interpretation, and will. His critique of objective truth and absolute values seemed to offer a way forward. If we can't escape our own perspective, why not make that perspective as powerful and life-affirming as possible? Nietzsche's genealogical method revealed how supposedly eternal truths and universal values are actually historical constructions, products of particular perspectives and power relations. His famous declaration that God is dead wasn't primarily a theological claim, but an acknowledgement that the transcendent foundations that had grounded Western civilization were no longer credible. In a world without objective truth or absolute values, human beings would need to become creators of their own meaning, artists of their own existence. This strategy seemed to transform the problem of our own understanding from limitation into opportunity. If we can't achieve objective knowledge, we can at least achieve authentic self-creation. If we can't discover eternal values, we can at least create values that serve life and growth. The Übermensch represents the individual who has overcome the need for external validation and learned to live according to self-imposed law. But Nietzsche's solution leaves us suspended above an abyss without adequate scaffolding for the creative task he envisions. Having demolished the traditional foundations of knowledge and value, he offers little guidance for how to build new ones. The will to power provides a general principle, Life seeks to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles, but this principle is too abstract to guide particular choices in concrete situations. More problematically, Nietzsche's critique of objective truth applies reflexively to his own philosophy. If all perspectives are interpretations, if all claims to knowledge are expressions of will to power, then what special status can we assign to Nietzsche's own genealogical investigations? Are his insights into the constructed nature of truth and value themselves just expressions of his particular will to power? And if so, why should we take them seriously as more than personal preferences? The genealogical method reveals the perspectival nature of all knowledge, but provides no criteria for distinguishing between perspectives that illuminate and perspectives that obscure, between interpretations that enhance life and interpretations that diminish it. Without some way of evaluating interpretations, Nietzsche's philosophy risks collapsing into arbitrary relativism, or worse, might makes right, nihilism. The deeper issue is that Nietzsche's embrace of perspectivism doesn't actually dissolve the problem of our own understanding. It simply refuses to acknowledge the recursive structure that makes perspective possible in the first place. Even the most creative act of self-overcoming requires a self that can recognize its own creative power, values that can guide the creative process, and some way of distinguishing genuine self-creation from mere self-deception. Nietzsche leaves the individual suspended above the abyss of meaninglessness with the injunction to create meaning, but he provides no tools for that creation beyond the abstract notion of will to power. The result is either existential paralysis, how does one begin to create when any beginning seems arbitrary, or the eventual reconstitution of dogma under new forms. The Übermensch, too, easily becomes the fanatic who mistakes the intensity of their conviction for the validity of their perspective. Taoism's reluctance toward structure. The Taoist tradition provides a counterpoint to Western philosophy's systematic ambitions. Rather than trying to solve the problem of our own understanding through rational analysis or creative assertion, Taoism embraces a strategic reticence, pointing toward the Tao that cannot be spoken and the wisdom that comes through Wu Wei, actionless action, effortless effort. The Tao Te Ching opens with the famous declaration, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." This immediately acknowledges the problem of our own understanding. The moment we try to capture ultimate reality in concepts or language, we move away from that reality. The Tao is not a thing or a principle that can be grasped intellectually, but the source from which all things emerge and to which they return. This approach seems to sidestep the recursive traps that snare other philosophical systems. Instead of trying to construct a systematic account of reality, Taoism offers poetic gestures toward a reality that exceeds all systematic accounts. Instead of providing definitive answers, it cultivates a quality of awareness that can respond appropriately to whatever arises. Instead of imposing human categories on nature, it seeks to align human action with the natural flow of events. The strategy of Wu Wei, acting in accordance with natural patterns rather than forcing outcomes through willful effort, appears to dissolve the problem of our own understanding by dissolving the separator who would seek to understand. In the state of Wu Wei, there is no gap between knower and known, actor and action, self and world. One becomes like water, taking the shape of whatever container it encounters, flowing around obstacles rather than trying to overcome them through force. But Taoism's strategic reticence, while protecting against certain kinds of philosophical error, also limits its applicability as a framework for deliberate action in complex situations. The poetic wisdom of the Tao Te Ching The sage does not attempt anything very big and thus achieves greatness, provides general orientation, but little specific guidance for navigating particular challenges. More problematically, the refusal to systematize or codify insights makes Taoist wisdom difficult to transmit and apply beyond the immediate context of individual realization. Each person must rediscover the Tao through personal practice, but this individualistic approach provides no way of building on previous insights or developing collective wisdom over time. The deeper limitation is that even Wu Wei requires a practitioner who can recognize when they're forcing and when they're flowing, who can distinguish genuine spontaneity from mere impulse, who can develop the sensitivity necessary for appropriate response. The cultivation of this sensitivity is itself a kind of understanding that must be developed through practice, which brings us back to the problem of our own understanding, now disguised as the problem of how to act without acting, know without knowing, understand without understanding. Taoism's reluctance to provide systematic guidance reflects a genuine wisdom about the limits of conceptual knowledge, but it also abandons the field to less reflective approaches. In refusing to engage with the problem of our own understanding directly, Taoism offers no tools for those who must operate in contexts that require more explicit coordination and deliberate planning. 1.2. The recurring structural problem. Across these classical attempts, from Plato's eternal forms through Kant's critical system to Nietzsche's perspectivism and Taoism's strategic reticence, we can trace a consistent pattern of structural failure. Each approach begins with genuine insight into some aspect of the problem of our own understanding, but each ultimately breaks down because it cannot sustain the recursive tension that constitutes conscious existence. The pattern unfolds predictably, ambition toward permanence. The framework seeks some stable ground that can anchor knowledge and guide action, whether eternal forms, transcendental categories, creative will, or natural flow. Expansion beyond functional scope. Having identified this ground, the system attempts to build a comprehensive account of reality that exceeds the recursive constraints within which all understanding operates. Confrontation with reality's unpredictability. The systematic edifice encounters aspects of experience that resist systematic treatment. The flux that undermines eternal forms, the historical emergence of supposedly timeless categories, the arbitrariness that haunts creative assertion, the need for structure that pure flow cannot provide, collapse into rigidity or retreat into abstraction, unable to hold the tension between systematic ambition and recursive constraint. The framework either hardens into dogma, treating provisional insights as eternal truths, or dissolves into abstraction, retreating from practical engagement into pure contemplation. The persistent failure lies not in the brilliance of these systems, each represents extraordinary intellectual achievement, but in their common aspiration to resolve what cannot be resolved. The problem of our own understanding is not a puzzle waiting for the right solution, but the permanent condition within which all understanding operates. Universality, once sought, becomes an intellectual liability. Any claim to have transcended the recursive structure of consciousness immediately falls back into that structure, like a hand trying to grasp itself. Attempts at systematization fracture under dynamic conditions because they assume a static relationship between knower and known that dynamic reality cannot sustain. Even philosophical humility arrives too late when it comes as an afterthought to systematic ambition. Kant's recognition of the limits of reason emerges only after constructing an elaborate critical system. Nietzsche's perspectivism develops only after demolishing traditional foundations. Taoism's reticence avoids systematic construction, but also avoids providing practical scaffolding for those who cannot retreat from the need for deliberate coordination, the need for different architecture. Perpetualism emerges from recognition that this recurring pattern of failure points toward a structural problem that requires different architectural principles. The classical frameworks fail not because they lack intellectual sophistication, but because they attempt to solve the problem of our own understanding rather than learning to work skillfully within its constraints. What if we built philosophical scaffolding that expected to remain recursive from the ground up? What if we designed frameworks that got stronger through the very tensions that break traditional systems? What if we accepted the problem of our own understanding as the creative constraint that makes authentic engagement possible, rather than the obstacle to be overcome? This shift in orientation, from solving to engaging, from transcending to inhabiting, from achieving certainty to developing skill, requires abandoning the dream of stepping outside the recursive loop. But in abandoning this impossible dream, we open ourselves to possibilities that systematic philosophy cannot access. The possibility of frameworks that remain responsive to complexity, scaffolding that adapts without losing structural integrity, tools that work precisely because they acknowledge their own limitations. The collapse of classical frameworks isn't a historical accident, but a structural necessity that points toward the need for post-systematic approaches. The grinding sound we've been hearing isn't the sound of philosophical failure, but the sound of intellectual history, clearing space for something built along entirely different principles. The recursive architecture that destroys traditional frameworks might be exactly what makes quantum native philosophy possible. 1.3. Contemporary attempts and their shortcomings. The 21st century has witnessed remarkable philosophical innovation. Thinkers have developed sophisticated critiques of traditional metaphysics, pioneered new approaches to consciousness and reality, and grappled seriously with the implications of scientific advances from quantum mechanics to cognitive neuroscience. Yet, for all their brilliance, these contemporary frameworks exhibit the same structural fragility that plagued their classical predecessors. The pattern is more subtle now, disguised by technical sophistication and theoretical innovation. But listen carefully, and you'll hear the same grinding sound. The sound of systems encountering the problem of our own understanding and buckling under tensions they cannot hold. Each contemporary framework offers genuine insights, but each ultimately breaks down because it cannot sustain the recursive engagement that conscious existence demands. What makes this contemporary collapse particularly instructive is how it reveals the inadequacy of both traditional systematic approaches and their postmodern alternatives. The attempts to construct new metaphysical systems fail in familiar ways, while the attempts to deconstruct all systematic thinking leave practitioners without scaffolding for constructive engagement. Neither approach has learned to work skillfully within the recursive constraints that define conscious existence. Graham Harman and object-oriented ontology. Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology represents one of the most ambitious contemporary attempts to develop a new metaphysical framework. Harman correctly diagnoses a crucial problem in modern philosophy: the tendency to reduce everything to human access, to make human consciousness the measure of all reality. His solution: to place objects and their withdrawn essence at the center of philosophical attention, initially appears to solve the problem of our own understanding by decentering human perspective entirely. Object-oriented ontology posits that objects exist independently of any relations, including relations to human consciousness. Objects withdraw from all attempts to grasp them completely, maintaining their essential reality in isolation from any network of connections or interactions. This withdrawal is not accidental but structural. It's what makes objects objects, rather than mere bundles of relations or effects. The strategy seems elegant. By making withdrawal essential to objects, Harman appears to solve the problem of anthropocentrism while acknowledging the limits of human knowledge. We can never fully access objects because objects are essentially inaccessible. This limitation isn't a failure of human cognition, but a feature of reality itself. But here's where. The problem of our own understanding reasserts itself with quantum native precision. Harman's objects become so withdrawn from relation that they cannot participate in the recursive processes that actually constitute both objectivity and subjectivity. His solution breaks the recursive loop so completely that objects can no longer interact with anything, including other objects, without losing their essential withdrawal. This creates what we might call the interaction problem of OOO. If objects are essentially withdrawn, how do they affect each other? How do they enter into the networks of causation, influence, and emergence that we observe everywhere in reality? Harman's answer, vicarious causation, mediated by sensual objects, only pushes the problem back a level without solving it. The vicarious causes must themselves be objects, but if they're truly objects, they too must withdraw from the relations they're supposed to mediate. More fundamentally, Harman's framework cannot accommodate the recursive nature of observation, an understanding that makes his own philosophy possible. The philosopher who theorizes about withdrawn objects is using consciousness to think about consciousness, independent reality, employing understanding to grasp what supposedly lies beyond understanding. The object-oriented ontologist must still participate in the recursive loops of inquiry, interpretation, and theoretical construction. But the framework provides no account of how this participation is possible if objects are genuinely withdrawn from all relation. The deeper issue is that O attempts to solve the problem of our own understanding by denying the relational structure that makes understanding possible in the first place. Reality becomes a collection of isolated substances rather than a field of recursive interactions. This purchase of metaphysical elegance comes at the cost of explanatory impotence. Harman's objects are so independent that they cannot account for interdependence, so withdrawn that they cannot explain emergence, so substantial that they cannot participate in the processes that generate substance itself. Quentin Melisseau and speculative realism. Quentin Melisseau's speculative realism represents perhaps the most sophisticated contemporary attempt to think reality in itself beyond the prison of human world correlation. His critique of correlationism, the post-Kantian assumption that we can only ever access relationships between thought and being, rather than being itself, is intellectually powerful and historically accurate. But his solution reveals how even the most rigorous attempts to escape the problem of our own understanding ultimately fall back into its recursive structure. Melisseau's strategy centers on the concept of absolute contingency, the idea that the only necessity is that everything could be otherwise. This contingency is not relative to human perspective or knowledge, but an absolute feature of reality itself. By grounding his system in the necessity of contingency, Melisseau claims to achieve genuine speculation about reality independent of human access to that reality. The argument unfolds with impressive logical rigor. If we cannot think the absolute, then we cannot think the impossibility of the absolute, which means we must be able to think the absolute after all. The absolute turns out to be absolute contingency, the fact that there are no eternal laws, no necessary connections, no stable structures that could not be otherwise at any moment. This contingency is knowable precisely because it's the condition that makes correlation itself contingent rather than necessary. But watch what happens when we apply the problem of our own understanding to Melissu's project. The philosopher who discovers absolute contingency is using understanding to establish what lies beyond the correlation between understanding and being. The argument for absolute contingency requires the very rational procedures, logical analysis, conceptual distinction, theoretical construction, that should themselves be contingent if absolute contingency is truly absolute. Melissu attempts to address this recursion through his concept of factuality. The fact that correlation exists is itself a fact that must be accounted for. But factuality still requires a thinker who can recognize facts, distinguish them from non-facts, and construct arguments about their implications. The absolute contingency that supposedly grounds everything beyond correlation still requires correlative thinking to establish its absoluteness. More problematically, absolute contingency becomes a new form of metaphysical dogma, the one necessity that governs all other contingencies. If everything could be otherwise, including the principle that everything could be otherwise, then absolute contingency undermines its own absoluteness. If it doesn't undermine itself, then it constitutes precisely the kind of eternal metaphysical principle that correlationism was supposed to make impossible. Melissu's framework ultimately exhibits the same structural instability that plagued classical metaphysics, just inverted. Where traditional systems sought to ground reality in necessity, speculative realism grounds reality in contingency. But both moves attempt to solve the problem of our own understanding by establishing some content, whether necessary or contingent, that exists independently of the recursive processes of thinking and being. Both break the recursive loop and wonder why their elegant theories cannot touch the ground of lived experience. Byung-Chul Han and the Critique of Contemporary Culture. Byung-Chul Han offers some of the most incisive diagnoses of contemporary digital culture available in current philosophical literature. His analyses of acceleration, transparency, burnout, and the achievement society illuminate crucial aspects of how technological capitalism shapes consciousness and social relations. His insights into how digital platforms create recursive loops, where our behaviors generate data that shapes algorithms that modify our behaviors, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of contemporary recursive dynamics. Han's work reveals how digital capitalism operates through what we might recognize as corrupted versions of the triune recursion. Social media platforms function by creating feedback loops between users, observers, content, objects, and algorithmic systems, medium. But these loops are designed to capture attention and generate profit rather than enable authentic engagement. The result is recursive systems that amplify rather than process tension, creating the acceleration and exhaustion that Han diagnoses so precisely. His analysis of psychopolitics shows how contemporary power operates not through external coercion, but through the modulation of interior states: desire, mood, attention, motivation. This represents a sophisticated grasp of how recursive relationships between individual psychology and systemic structures can be manipulated for purposes of control. Han understands that the most effective forms of power are those that work through, rather than against, the recursive nature of consciousness. But here's where Han's analysis encounters its structural limitation. It remains trapped in description without providing scaffolding for transformation. His diagnoses are brilliant, but they offer no tools for constructive engagement with the recursive dynamics he identifies. He can describe how digital capitalism corrupts authentic temporality, but he cannot provide methods for cultivating different temporal experiences within digital environments. This limitation reflects a deeper problem with Han's approach to the problem of our own understanding. He recognizes that contemporary culture involves complex recursive loops, but his analyses assume a position outside these loops from which they can be objectively diagnosed. The critic who analyzes digital acceleration must use digital tools and participate in digital networks. The philosopher who critiques transparency culture must publish and promote his work through the very systems of communication and attention that he identifies as problematic. Hahn gestures toward alternatives: ritual, contemplation, slowness, depth. But these gestures remain abstract because they're not grounded in practical frameworks for working within rather than against contemporary recursive dynamics. His call for idleness and vita contemplativa assumes we can step outside the systems he critiques rather than learning to engage them more skillfully. The result is a form of cultural criticism that increases sophistication without enabling transformation. Readers of Hahn become more aware of how they're trapped in recursive loops of acceleration and transparency, but this awareness doesn't translate into capacity for different kinds of engagement. The diagnosis becomes another form of intellectual consumption rather than a tool for practical recalibration. More fundamentally, Hahn's framework cannot account for its own possibility. If psychopolitics is as totalizing as he suggests, how does critical consciousness arise? If digital capitalism has colonized interiority so completely, what enables the recognition of this colonization? His analyses require exactly the kind of contemplative distance that his own diagnoses suggest has become impossible under contemporary conditions. Slavoj Žižek and dialectical radicalism. Slavoj Žižek represents contemporary philosophy's most visible practitioner of dialectical thinking, combining Lacanian psychoanalysis, German idealism, and cultural critique in ways that generate genuine insights into contemporary ideological formations. His analyses reveal the unconscious investments that sustain seemingly rational political and economic arrangements, and his dialectical inversions often illuminate dimensions of experience that other approaches miss entirely. Žižek's strength lies in his ability to sustain multiple perspectives simultaneously, holding tensions that other thinkers resolve prematurely. His readings of popular culture, political events, and philosophical texts reveal recursive patterns where apparent opposites secretly depend on each other, where revolutionary gestures conceal conservative investments, where progressive politics reproduces the very structures it claims to oppose. This dialectical approach appears to embrace rather than solve the problem of our own understanding. Žižek's philosophy acknowledges that thinking is always already caught within the ideological structures it seeks to analyze, that critical consciousness emerges from, rather than stands outside the systems it criticizes. His use of psychoanalytic concepts, the unconscious, the real, jouissance, provides tools for understanding how recursive relationships between individual psychology and social structure generate both symptoms and possibilities for transformation. But Žižek's dialectical loops ultimately become self-defeating. His perpetual inversions and reframings create intellectual motion without practical direction. Every position is revealed to contain its opposite. Every critique is shown to reproduce what it opposes. Every solution is demonstrated to generate new problems. The result is a form of intellectual vertigo where critical consciousness becomes an end in itself, rather than a means toward more skillful engagement. This reflects a deeper problem with Žižek's approach to recursion. While he acknowledges that thinking operates within recursive loops, his practice involves endless reflection on these loops rather than disciplined navigation of them. The dialectical method becomes a way of avoiding the practical challenge of acting within recursive constraints, rather than a tool for more effective action. Žižek's work exhibits what we might call Dialectical indulgence. The intellectual pleasure of discovering new inversions and complications takes precedence over the practical work of constructive engagement. His analyses reveal the recursive nature of ideological formation, but provide no scaffolding for working constructively. With this recursion, readers become more sophisticated about the complexities of their situation, but no more capable of acting effectively within those complexities. More problematically, Žižek's endless dialectical critique assumes a position of intellectual superiority to the recursive loops he analyzes. The dialectical critic sees through illusions that capture others, recognizes inversions that escape ordinary consciousness, maintains distance from investments that compromise less sophisticated thinkers. But this critical distance is itself an illusion. Žižek's own intellectual position is sustained by the very academic and media systems that his analyses should call into question. The deeper issue is that Žižek's dialectical method cannot distinguish between productive and destructive forms of recursion. All recursive relationships become grist for the dialectical mill. All tensions become opportunities for intellectual elaboration. But some recursive processes generate insight and growth, while others produce paralysis and confusion. Some tensions need to be held, while others need to be resolved. Žižek's framework provides no criteria for making these distinctions, leaving practitioners with sophisticated tools for analysis but no guidance for action. Jordan Peterson and archetypal mapping. Jordan Peterson's intellectual project attempts to ground human meaning and moral guidance in archetypal patterns that supposedly transcend historical and cultural contingency. Drawing on Jungian psychology, mythological analysis, and evolutionary psychology, Peterson argues that certain symbolic structures appear consistently across cultures and historical periods, providing stable reference points for individual development and social organization. Peterson's approach initially appears to address the problem of our own understanding by grounding human meaning in patterns that exist independently of individual consciousness. Archetypes like the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, and the great mother supposedly emerge from the collective unconscious and provide frameworks for understanding that don't depend on particular theoretical commitments or cultural perspectives. The archetypal approach seems to solve several philosophical problems simultaneously. It grounds meaning without requiring metaphysical commitments about eternal truths. It acknowledges cultural variation while maintaining universal human patterns. It provides practical guidance for individual development while respecting the complexity of human psychology. Peterson's integration of clinical practice with theoretical analysis appears to demonstrate that archetypal thinking can bridge the gap between abstract philosophy and lived experience. But Peterson's framework ultimately reproduces the same rigidity that plagued classical systematic philosophy. His archetypes become fixed categories that individuals must conform to rather than dynamic patterns that emerge through interaction. The hero's journey provides a template that adventurers must follow rather than a tool for understanding how different forms of growth and challenge might unfold. This rigidity reflects Peterson's attempt to solve the problem of our own understanding by appealing to content, archetypal patterns, that supposedly exists independently of the recursive processes of interpretation and application. But archetypes only function as guides for human development when they're interpreted, applied, and modified through ongoing engagement with particular situations and challenges. The moment they become fixed templates, they lose their capacity to respond to the dynamic complexity of actual human existence. Peterson's clinical work reveals this tension clearly. His therapeutic practice involves helping individuals discover their own authentic patterns of meaning and development, often in ways that deviate significantly from archetypal templates. But his theoretical commitments require him to ground this authentic individuation in universal patterns, rather than recognizing it as an emergent process that generates its own structural integrity through recursive engagement with challenge and uncertainty. More fundamentally, Peterson's framework cannot account for its own historical emergence and cultural specificity. His archetypal interpretations reflect particular theoretical commitments: Jungian psychology, evolutionary psychology, conservative political philosophy, that shape what he recognizes as universal patterns. The archetypes that appear universal from his perspective might look quite different from other theoretical and cultural vantage points. The deeper problem is that Peterson's approach attempts to transcend the problem of our own understanding by appealing to patterns that supposedly exist prior to interpretation. But these patterns only become meaningful through interpretive frameworks that are themselves historical and contestable. His archetypes require the very recursive processes of understanding that they're supposed to ground, creating the same circular dependencies that undermined classical philosophical systems. Agnes Callard and the Theory of Aspiration. Agnes Callard's work on aspiration represents one of the most philosophically sophisticated contemporary attempts to understand how individuals can transform their values and identities over time. Her analysis of how we can come to value what we don't currently understand addresses crucial questions about personal development, education, and the possibility of genuine change. Callard's theory recognizes that aspiration involves a fundamental recursion. We must use our current values and understanding to pursue values and forms of understanding that will transform our current perspective. The aspiring musician must use their current limited appreciation of music to develop the deeper appreciation that will retrospectively reveal the limitations of their starting point. This creates a temporal loop where the endpoint of development provides the criteria for evaluating the development process itself. This recognition of recursive structure appears to place Callard's work in productive engagement with the problem of our own understanding. Rather than trying to step outside the recursive loop, she attempts to understand how growth and transformation can occur within recursive constraints. Her examples of aspiration: becoming a parent, converting to a religion, developing aesthetic appreciation, all involve processes where the aspirer cannot fully understand or justify their aspiration from their starting point. Callard's approach also acknowledges that aspiration involves risk and uncertainty. The aspirer cannot guarantee that their transformation will be worthwhile because they lack the transformed perspective necessary for evaluation. This creates what Callard calls proleptic reasons, considerations that will become reasons only if the aspiration succeeds in transforming the aspirer's evaluative framework. But Callard's theory of aspiration lacks the structural scaffolding necessary to distinguish between productive and destructive forms of transformation, between aspirations that lead to genuine development and those that lead to self-deception or capture by external forces. Her framework provides no criteria for evaluating aspirations except the retrospective judgment of the transformed aspirer. But this judgment is itself suspect, because it's made from within the perspective that the aspiration created. This limitation reflects a deeper problem with Callard's approach to recursion. While she recognizes that aspiration involves recursive loops, she treats these loops as features of individual psychology rather than structural patterns that require disciplined navigation. Her analyses remain primarily descriptive rather than providing tools for more skillful engagement with aspirational processes. More problematically, Callard's theory cannot distinguish between authentic aspiration and various forms of psychological and cultural manipulation. If aspirers cannot evaluate their aspirations from their starting point, how can they distinguish between genuine calls to growth and sophisticated forms of exploitation? How can they recognize when their aspiration is leading toward greater authenticity versus adaptation to external pressures they don't yet understand? Callard's framework assumes that aspiration is primarily an individual process, but many of the examples she analyzes, religious conversion, aesthetic education, professional development, occur within institutional and cultural contexts that shape both the aspiration itself and the criteria used to evaluate its success. Her theory provides no tools for analyzing how these contexts influence aspirational processes or for distinguishing between contexts that support authentic development and those that capture aspiration for other purposes. The result is a sophisticated analysis of how transformation occurs that provides little guidance for engaging transformation more skillfully. Callard's insights increase understanding of aspirational processes but don't translate into improved capacity for navigating these processes practically. Her work remains trapped within the same descriptive limitations that characterize much contemporary philosophy. Brilliant analysis that cannot touch the ground of lived engagement. 1.4. The recursive trap. Across these contemporary attempts, from Harman's withdrawn objects through Melissu's absolute contingency to Hahn's cultural diagnosis, Žižek's dialectical loops, Peterson's archetypal rigidity, and Callard's unscaffolded aspiration, we can trace the same structural pattern that undermined classical philosophical systems. Each framework encounters the problem of our own understanding and attempts to solve it through strategies that ultimately reproduce the very difficulties they seek to overcome. The contemporary versions are more sophisticated than their classical predecessors, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Recognition of limitation. Each framework begins with genuine insight into problems with previous approaches. Correlationism, anthropocentrism, cultural acceleration, ideological capture, archetypal rigidity, or transformational opacity. Systematic response. Each develops sophisticated theoretical tools designed to address these limitations. Withdrawn objects, absolute contingency, cultural diagnosis, dialectical critique, archetypal mapping, or aspirational analysis. Encounter with recursion. Each framework encounters the fact that its own theoretical activity participates in the recursive process it seeks to analyze or transcend. Thinking about thinking, understanding, critiquing critique. Structural breakdown. Each framework either breaks the recursive loop so completely that it loses explanatory power, Harman, Melissu, or gets lost within recursive loops without providing scaffolding for navigation, Hahn, Žižek, Peterson, Callard. What makes these contemporary failures particularly instructive is how they reveal the inadequacy of both systematic and anti-systematic responses to the problem of our own understanding. The attempts to construct new metaphysical systems, Harman, Melissu, Peterson, fail in ways that mirror classical systematic philosophy. The attempts to maintain critical distance from systematic thinking, Hahn, Žižek, Callard, fail to provide constructive alternatives. Neither approach has learned what quantum mechanics revealed about physical reality and what the problem of our own understanding reveals about conscious existence. That reality is quantum native, structured recursively through and through, and that any adequate philosophical framework must be built to work with rather than against this recursive structure. The recursive trap that captures all these contemporary frameworks points toward the need for a fundamentally different approach, one that doesn't try to solve the problem of our own understanding, but learns to work skillfully within the creative constraints it provides. This requires building philosophical scaffolding that gets stronger rather than weaker when subjected to recursive analysis, frameworks that can hold tension without resolution while enabling action without certainty. The grinding sound we've been hearing, the sound of sophisticated frameworks, buckling under recursive pressure, clears space for something built along entirely different architectural principles. The question is whether we can learn to construct philosophy that is quantum native from the ground up, designed to expect and work with the recursive structure that characterizes conscious existence at every level. Postlude to Part 1. The Clearing. We've traveled through centuries of philosophical ambition and witnessed the same pattern, repeating with remarkable consistency. From Plato's eternal forms to Haman's withdrawn objects, from Kant's critical architecture to Melissu's absolute contingency, from Nietzsche's creative destruction to Žižek's dialectical loops, each framework encounters the problem of our own understanding and breaks apart at precisely the point where it tries to step outside the recursive structure of consciousness, examining consciousness. This isn't a story of intellectual failure. These are some of the most brilliant minds in human history, and their insights continue to illuminate crucial aspects of existence. But their structural breakdown points towards something profound: the recognition that reality itself might be recursive through and through, and that any framework capable of bearing real weight must be built to work with rather than against this recursive architecture. The grinding sound we've been hearing, the sound of elegant systems buckling under recursive pressure, is actually the sound of intellectual history clearing space for something unprecedented. Not another attempt to solve the problem of our own understanding, but the first serious attempt to build philosophical scaffolding designed to function creatively within its constraints. What emerges in this clearing is the possibility of quantum native philosophy, frameworks that expect observer effects, that anticipate non-local correlations, that work with uncertainty and superposition, rather than demanding classical either-or resolution. Philosophy that doesn't break when subjected to recursive analysis, but gets stronger through the very tensions it's designed to hold. The problem of our own understanding isn't going away. It's built into the structure of consciousness itself, the permanent condition within which all thinking, all experiencing, all authentic engagement must occur. But this permanence isn't a limitation. It's the creative constraint that makes growth, discovery, and transformation possible. You are already within the recursive loop. You cannot step outside it. But you can learn to navigate it more consciously, more skillfully, more responsively. You can build scaffolding that enables authentic engagement with reality, even though, especially because, you can never fully comprehend it. The clearing is complete. The space has been opened. Now the real work begins, to be continued.